My name is Jared. I work for the School of Science. Welcome everybody to Casper College. You will have noticed when you were coming in that we have some of our biology programs here tonight. They are a big part in helping make this happen. So Betsy was the one that approached the college about finding a way to work together. The Lab Girl, which is the book that they're focusing on, it looks at making a space within research. How do you build a life in research? And so the college was happy to join and see how we could help her spread that message. So when you leave today, I'm going to encourage you, if you can check out the plants. They are for sale by donation. Those are all raised in the greenhouse. We also have some herbarium samples out there as well. And then tomorrow, if you are interested, the environmental studies group, they are actually doing a clothing swap in celebration of Earth Day in Leasinger Hall, which is just next door over. So if you want to bring some items of clothing, you can swap it with some items they have. It sounds like they've had a pretty big turnout today of donations, so it should be a fun event. And I'm going to pass it over to Betsy.
Hi everyone, and welcome, and thank you for being here tonight as part of our NEA Big Read program. I'd like to start just by acknowledging our grantor, Arts Midwest. They were very generous in their grant funding for this program, and also thank the Casper College School of Science for helping make this event possible here at Durham Auditorium. Tonight's keynote explores what storytelling has to teach science and how science can deepen the stories we tell, helping us better understand what it means to be human in relationship with the living world. We're honored to have Susan Twite with us tonight. This is her second event, and Susan is a botanist, award-winning author, and longtime storyteller of the natural world. Across her 13 books and many essays, she is focused on what she calls restoring our relationship with nature and helping us see ourselves as part of a larger living system. Susan will also be with us again tomorrow at noon at the library for a writing workshop. So if you're interested, we do have about 10 spots left in that workshop. And to continue exploring Susan's work, I would encourage you to find her Substack newsletter. It's called Cultivating Terraphilia, where she shares reflections and writing about our connection to the natural world. Susan also has a forthcoming book called Earthbound, and that's being published this October. And it invites readers to reconnect with the natural world through simple, mindful practices. Tonight, Susan will share her keynote, and then we'll have time for questions. She also has her books for sale out in the lobby. She will be available to sign those books. Please join me in welcoming Susan Twite.
Okay, sound check first. Can you hear me? Yes? Back? Can you hear me? All the way in back? Okay, good. Good evening. Thanks for coming out on a windy, Casper-ish evening. I have to say that this morning I walked from the little place I'm staying over to Grant Street Market in the Big Tree neighborhood and watched ravens surfing like they were in Hawaii on a big wave contest. They were just doing the whoosh up to the top of the wave, slide across the front, go back up. It was super cool. And I thought to myself, okay, you can enjoy the wind. I don't fly, so I don't find it as delightful, but it was really fun to see them enjoying it. Thanks to you all for turning out. Thanks to Betsy for inviting me here to Casper. And thanks to Natrona County Library and the Casper College and College of Science. It's a delight to be here. And I see more people coming in. Cool, yes, welcome. Find a seat, there's lots. Pick one you like. That's me on the screen doing the things I do. I am a botanist. My area of botany at this point is restoration ecology, and I start out there because that's coming full circle for me. I started my career in Yellowstone, and recently I've been back in the summers hand-pulling invasive weeds. I call it weeding Yellowstone, which is Something that most people would think is insane, but it's really rewarding for me. By removing invasive weeds, I'm improving the habitat for all the other beings who live there, including humans. So that's me out in my volunteer Park Service polyester uniform that's hotter than heck, sweating while digging up invasive hound's tongue. Just to give you an idea of who I am. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, the Potawatomi botanist and scientist, says in Braiding Sweetgrass, a book that if you have not read, please do. In some native languages, the word for plants translates as those who take care of us. And they do. If you think that you don't need plants, I have an exercise for you. Breathe. Just take a breath. Take one inhale through your nose all the way deep into your belly, noticing the air traveling into your lungs, and then breathe that back out again. Breathing is essential. You know, we can survive a month without food. Seems hard to believe, but we can, without expiring. We can survive 5 to 7 days without water, and we're 60% water by weight, so that's pretty impressive that we can go that far. Do you know how long we can survive without air, without oxygen? 5 minutes. Where does that oxygen come from that's in the air? Is it just kind of there? It's just there, it's a gift of our atmosphere. Does anybody know? Plants. And the other photosynthesizers, the beings who make their own food with sunlight and green pigment, which include algae and microscopic bacteria of some sorts. We have a reciprocal relationship with them. Every time you inhale, you are pulling in the oxygen that they exhale as their waste gas from making their food from sunlight. So every time you breathe in, you're breathing in what they breathe out. And every time you breathe out, plants are breathing in the carbon dioxide that we breathe out as our waste gas. So it's a really cool reciprocal relationship. It's not synchronous. You know, as I go, some plant is not going, but it is reciprocal. And without plants and the other photosynthesizing beings, we would not have the percentage of oxygen that we need to survive. Our atmosphere would have lost enough oxygen that we wouldn't be able to make it. We'd be like the astronauts up in space, which was the super coolest thing, right? The Artemis 2 crew. That was fabulous. Oh my God. If you want something hopeful to think about in these times, that journey and their camaraderie in space and their kindness and their observations were just so, so beautiful. But we would be like the astronauts in space. We wouldn't be able to breathe without supplemental oxygen if we didn't have plants and photosynthesizing beings exhaling it all the time. They are, as the poet Clifford Burke has written, our breathing buddies, plants and photosynthesizing microbes. So whenever you take a breath, whenever you remember to inhale, and mind you, breathing is one of those things that gets done in our lizard brain back here, our brainstem. That's the site of all of our automatic functions. But every time you're conscious of your breathing, stop and think about a plant and say thank you. Or a microbe, a photosynthesizing microbe. Oops, wrong way. Must use technology correctly. Plants are one of the central characters in this story I want to tell you. And it's a story that, like the story in Lab Girl, if any of you have read Hope Jaron's memoir, that's the focus book for this week, it's a story that illuminates what it means to be human. Plants actually teach us a lot about what it means to be human. And in my life, they have taught me an enormous amount of what it means to be individually. Plants, what we can learn from plants illuminates our shared humanity and our brains, which are, for a lot of us, kind of the central thing that we think about of being human is our minds. And you know, your brain has 2 hemispheres. You've got, in some, the sort of logical, rational, analytical, sequential left hemisphere, and you've got your dreamy, meaning-making, holistic, relational, intuitive right brain. And we tend to think in a sort of very broad sense of our right brains being the artistic brain and our left brains being the scientific or the analytical brain. And that's more or less true, but that's a summarization. It turns out that learning about plants, we can learn a lot about ourselves and how our brains work because we're the ones doing the learning. And if we stop and think about why we're interested in what we're interested in and how we approach it and our perspective on it, we learn a lot about ourselves as well as collecting a lot of data on plants. In Lab Girl, Hope Jaron wrote, people, like plants, grow toward the light. Think about that. It's a metaphor, but it's also true. We tend to aim toward that which is inspiring, that which gives us hope, and that kind of thing. Plants actually grow toward the light. Plants don't have eyes, but they can tell you what color the light is, how long it's been that color, how bright the lumens are, and all those kinds of things, which makes sense if you are basically a biological solar panel and you're collecting the energy from sunlight to make your food. You need to know a lot about light. A plant knows when I'm standing in its light and shading that plant. A plant knows if there's an eclipse. Plants behave very differently, and I just use the word behave with plants, and we do that now because we know some things about plants that we didn't know when I was in grad school, when dinosaurs roamed the earth 1,000 years ago. Plants behave differently during an eclipse because the light has changed dramatically than they do before the eclipse happens. So plants are very visual creatures without having eyes, which is fascinating. So this journey, those are some of my favorite plants, just so you know. And that is a slide of me horsepacking in my favorite part of Wyoming. That's headed up towards Bonneville Pass in the Washakie Wilderness, north and west of Du Bois, the edge of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So this journey comes in 3 parts that reflect kind of the phases of human development. Born to wonder, which is the first part. Oh, backwards. I can do technology, I just have to focus. Which is childhood. Joining the tribe, which for me is the work and career, the science part of my life, and sharing knowledge through stories, which is the part when we get incredibly wise and we figure out how the world works and how we work, and we share that knowledge with everyone else. And yes, I was being sarcastic, but it is to a certain extent true that one thing we can do as we learn is share our knowledge with others. So I grew up in an absolutely ordinary family in a suburb, in an absolutely ordinary middle-class suburb, in an ordinary ranch house with an ordinary yard, in a typical middle-class white baby boom era family. 2 parents of opposite sexes, 2 children, boy first, then 2 years later, girl. And that's where the normality ends. As you can see by the people on that screen. That's my brother and I on a jungle gym, where I probably shouldn't have been at that age, looking really saintly, don't you think? Not. That's my family. The first camera I got, a brownie box camera. They are lined up so I can take a picture of them bird watching. Not exactly suburban normal. And that's my mother on her honeymoon with my dad in Mount Shasta in California. They were camping in a place where the snowbanks were 10 feet tall still. So that's the ordinariness in my family right there. That's all of it. My dad biked to work. He developed drugs for a living. He was an organic chemist. He biked to work 5 miles with his lab coat on every day in the suburbs. My mom took the bus to her job as a school librarian, which was also not ordinary. And we had a car, sort of. In the 2 cars in every driveway suburbs, we had a car. It was a delivery van that my engineer granddad kitted out as a homemade camper way before RVs were cool. My family was so normal that, whoops, I'm going to get this right next time. My family was so normal that in our house we had cabinets built in the basement for all the nature specimens, the collections of neatly labeled, they had to be labeled, seashells and the rock specimens. We had a black light so we could fluoresce minerals and figure out which ones they were. I never really got that, but I liked the light. We had a garden of native wildflowers. We had roadkill held for study in the freezer. We had binoculars and a shelf of nature field guides close at hand. That's how normal we were. Well, my classmates' parents took them to the beach and Disneyland on family vacations. Oh my God, I would have killed to go to the beach or Disneyland. My family spent our summers, our weekends, and every spare moment, even if it wasn't a school vacation, on the road in the homemade camper van, going to national parks and national forests and wilderness areas and national wildlife refuges, camping and backpacking and hiking and studying nature. One of my fondest memories is coming back from one of those weekend trips. My brother and I had collected frogs in a big institutional, like mayonnaise jar with water. And we thought we screwed the lid on tight. And a mule deer jumped out in front of the van, and Dad braked really hard, and that jar tipped over. And there were like 18 frogs bouncing around in the van and water everywhere. And oh my, we were not in good, we weren't loved right at that moment. But that was my life. Our nature focus, and as a kid, unless someone tells you that this is not normal, you don't know. Unless someone tells you should be logical, you see the world both in dreams and in field guides that tell you which wildflower it is. You don't stop and think about what's what, and it's all very holistic. You're just involved in the awe and wonder unless someone tells you to be different. So we were considered eccentric by our neighbors and our friends, but mostly harmless, except times like the hot summer afternoon when a grade school friend of mine came over to play after school, and we decided to get popsicles out of the freezer, and she raced to the kitchen and beat me to the freezer drawer, pulled it open, and screamed. I looked in the drawer and forgot that my brother had collected a dead red-tailed hawk on the roadside the day before and put it in the freezer with its wings half outstretched so he could dissect it later. She absolutely never touched that freezer drawer again. She didn't even go in the kitchen if she could help it, because she didn't know what she'd find. My brother took up bird watching in a serious way at age 9, when other 9-year-old boys were hiding under the covers and reading, I don't know what, maybe Lolita. He was reading Bent's Life of Birds, all 8 volumes, with a flashlight. My parents focused on birds too, and that birds, then the pursuit of birds, shaped our family vacations. I chose plants. I was 7, and I knew I wanted to be a plant girl because plants do not get up early. They don't require you to go to strange places like sewage lagoons because some rare red-legged hoo-ha has paused in migration at the only water between here and Cody, and it happens to be a sewage lagoon, and that's where all the birders congregate. They also hold still when you're trying to identify them, which I regarded as a good idea. So my favorite part of my childhood yard, I'm not going to get this right, just bear with me. My favorite part of my childhood yard, my mom was a gardener. And at some point, she realized that lots around us in the burbs were getting bulldozed and the native plants were going away. And so she set my dad, when he biked home from work, to scout out lots that were going to be bulldozed. And we got on our bikes in the evenings and biked over to whatever the lot was that he'd identified with our trowels and our bike baskets and our used plastic bags, and we dug up woodland plants to bring home for my mom's wildflower garden. I thought that was normal. It apparently wasn't, but I loved it. I spent time encouraging those plants to settle in. That's how normal I was. I talked to them. I told them this was a good place to be, that we would take good care of them, just the way I talked to the big box elder tree in the backyard that I climbed up into whenever nobody noticed and took a book and disappeared for hours at a time and no one could find me. I talked to plants. They were my kin. I grew up in a family of 2 parents who were only children and grandparents very far away on opposite coasts. So there was just the 4 of us. I didn't have cousins or aunts and uncles. Plants were my people. They were the ones I talked to when I couldn't talk to anybody else in my family. I went on my first hike as a toddler. I know this because my father, ever the scientist, whenever we traveled anywhere, took field notes. He took along an old portable typewriter, and as my brother and I were going to sleep on our cots in the back of the camper, I would hear him hunting and pecking. He never could actually touch type. Pat, pat, punching the keys, typing out trip notes, which had such important information as the price of gas in Rock Springs that year, in case you wanted the cheapest gas station. But they also said stuff like, Bill and Susan made the entire 5-mile, mostly level hike without being carried. It's my first hike. I wasn't 2. We were indoctrinated early in my family. After that, then we proved we could hike, so we hiked more often, and that's when all of our trips became trips to wild places, which I loved. I thought it was wonderful. We spent months on the road in the summers. My parents had liberal vacations. I especially loved oh my gosh, I really cannot get this. I especially loved the summers we spent in the Sagebrush Sea. Wyoming, especially northwest Wyoming, all those basins full of sagebrush, those were my places. They imprinted themselves on me before I had words to describe why. And I remember vividly when I was about 9, one June day, we were cruising from Laramie headed towards Yellowstone. We were headed at that point toward Elk Mountain, and my dad had a lead foot, and he had the accelerator down as far as he could go on that old delivery van, and it was not quite hauling you know what, because it wasn't that fast, but he was trying to make it fast. And we hit a steep hill, and in an old shift engine, when you needed to shift, the engine would knock really hard, and you could feel it through the floor. I had my face in a book. My dad was driving, my mom was navigating, my brother and I were sitting in the dinette, and I'm reading a book, a mystery probably, and I'm ignoring everything. And the whole van knocked when the engine knocked before he shifted down, and I looked up, I looked out the open windows, and it was a sea of sagebrush with the lupin. It was June, the lupin was just starting to bloom, and the air blowing in the open windows was full of that scent that to me is gorgeous. You either love or hate the smell of sagebrush, I know that. To me, it's a beautiful thing. I looked up, I smelled that mix of camphor and sweet jasmine and lemon flowers, and said to myself, home. And then I put my face back in the book. And I didn't then have any idea what that meant. But to me, I knew I was home when I could smell sagebrush. And there's absolutely no separation when you're a kid between observation and learning the name of big sagebrush and kinship, feeling like it's your relative, that plant is your relative. I learned the names and the habits of hundreds of wildflowers. I know when people ask me a native plant now, what part of my life I learned it in, because if the common name comes first, it's childhood. If the scientific name comes first, it's college on. So 2 different languages in my brain stored in different places for plants, but always plants. So for me, I was operating with both sides of the brain, talking to each other in that time of my life and not thinking about it. Barbara McClintock puts it really well. Barbara McClintock was a geneticist who worked at Cold Spring Harbor in Massachusetts for decades, cultivating corn plants. She's the geneticist who discovered that genes can jump and bring new traits into plants. And she was kind of an iconoclastic scientist. She worked by herself a lot at that time. And in her Nobel Prize speech, her speech accepting the Nobel Prize in genetics, she said, I don't feel I really know the story if I don't watch the plant all along. So I know every plant in the field, I know them intimately. That's how we know nature as kids. We don't separate between the analytical part and the dreaming with nature part. But that changes as we get older. And for me, things changed when I went into science. On the left, and I guess I was destined because that's my great-grandfather. He was a desert botanist. He moved to Tucson on September 13th of 1903. He stepped off a train from New York City, newly minted PhD from Columbia University, and got off in Tucson to study the Sonoran Desert. And that's him very much the Edwardian man of science, looking very serious in his whatever, that car with the rubber tires that probably shouldn't have been driving across the open desert where there's cactus vines. Looking very serious. He's out there to do research. And that's me on the right, studying the greater Yellowstone ecosystem like 70 years later. I graduated early from high school because my parents were going to England on sabbatical. and I wanted to go with them. And their deal was, we'll take you, we'll pay your way if you go to college when you come back. I was, at 17, not interested in college at all. I was going to take my camera and hitchhike the West and become the Georgia O'Keeffe of nature photography. I didn't need college for that. I wasn't going. Wasn't interested. Didn't care. But I had this lure dangled in front of me. It was pretty irresistible. Would you like to spend an all-expense-paid 9 months in Cambridge, in England, and learn about a different place? Hang out with different people? So I said yes. I didn't say yes that I would go to college when I got back, but we had a little difference of opinion about that. So I went with them to Cambridge. I had a great time. I joined the local, I was supposed to be going to lectures. I had a course of study lined out. I joined the local Youth Conservation Corps and learned how to do ecological restoration of chalk grasslands by eliminating bracken fern, and how to coppice oak woodlands, and do all sorts of other fun stuff, including how to drink beer at age 17 in English pubs, because there's no minimum age there. So it was great. And then, of course, it all comes to an end. We come back to the States, and my parents forcefully reminded me of our deal, and so I had to go to college. So I went to a state university that had a fine arts photography program and spent the better part of a couple of semesters playing with large format cameras and rock climbing and caving and doing stuff like that, which counted as college for some reason. It seemed like it to me. And in that carefree existence comes along the director of the university's botanical photography lab, which I didn't even know existed. And he saw in me an eager convert and dangled the promises of all this cool camera equipment, plus field trips, Big Bend in the spring, Yellowstone in summer, Canyonlands in the winter, and an assistantship for a sophomore in college. I was like, sign me up. And so suddenly I was back in science, where I hadn't intended to be, and I was actually attending college where they expected you to do stuff instead of just play. But I decided, this is cool. There's good field trips, there's good camera equipment, and anyway, maybe I could actually get paid for doing what I wanted to do, which was photographing and studying wild places. I didn't know then that pay was not necessarily part of it, but I was optimistic. The only hard part was I was only girl in the lab. This is back in the days when there weren't many women in field science. And I was the only girl on the field trips. And I was the only girl in most of the field ecology courses I took. I didn't mind, but I didn't want to stand out. So I kind of changed my uniform and my behavior. I started wearing jeans and turtlenecks or t-shirts and caps and cowboy hats and hiking boots and cowboy boots, and carrying a field notebook and a camera, and being cheerful and non-threatening. And my hair was waist length then, and a king ropes cap is the perfect thing to stuff your waist-length hair in because there's enough space. That's what I did. So I pretended I wasn't a girl, which was more or less successful. The harder part was I had to stop talking to plants, even in my mind. I had to adopt the science persona and remind myself that plants were my subject of study. They weren't kin anymore. I kind of set aside the wonder for analysis, and I don't think I thought about that then. I was just trying to fit in, just being part of the fraternity, as it were. And the summer after my sophomore year, I had the great good luck of being invited to join a graduate level field course that took place at the Yellowstone Bighorn Research Association, which still exists above Red Lodge, Montana, right along the Beartooth Front, which is a spectacular place if you've not seen it. Literally, the earth just bends upward and rises into this alpine plateau. It's the largest alpine plateau in North America, up at 10,000 more feet. And I got to study field ecology with all these graduate students. We did field trips. We did vegetation patterns from Cody to Helena. We traced, how the types of vegetation changed from grassland to shrublands to forest to alpine, and why, and how the geology affected it, and why sagebrush was in this valley and not that valley, what would prevent it from being in that one, and the way historic fires could be mapped in the spread of aspen groves, and how grazers like elk and cows affected what plants were on this side of the fence versus that side of the fence, and all that good stuff. For me, it was childhood all over again, except in the structure of science. I got to be outside, paying attention to what was going on with the plants and the land around me. And it was like heaven, really. I was totally all in. For me, field ecology is where botany really came alive. I am not the sort who's good at taxonomy. You might have guessed that by now. I'm not good in a lab. When I read Lab Girl and read about Hope Jaren's career and how she and her lab mate, Bill, who she took with her to every job, they're like twins, not romantic twins, but work twins, how they refitted an old version of a mass spectrometer with doing, altering the machine so it could do these new cool things. I was like, oh man, take me outside. That's gonna put me to sleep right away. But outside, I'm good. I'm just not a lab girl at all. But I admire what Hope did. Instead of returning to college for my junior year, after that great field course, I talked my way into volunteer work in Yellowstone for the biologist's office and finished my undergraduate degree mostly by doing field work for independent study credit, which has to be one of the best scams ever. I live to say that. I did have to come back to the classroom one semester a year. I was reluctant. I always was late and left early, but I did it. I joined a field crew with the biologist's office in Yellowstone the next summer and got to work mostly over the north edge of Yellowstone, which is a botanist who studies plant communities. That's the most interesting part because it's the most varied. It's the most varied geology, and thus it's the most varied vegetation. And then I was offered a seasonal job, Nirvana, that actually paid decently on the Shoshone National Forest, which is the forest that runs from the Beartooth Plateau to South Pass, east of Yellowstone. It's part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, where my college boyfriend, who eventually became my first husband, worked. After my first season on the Shoshone, I don't know how I had this kind of chutzpah, but I did. I talked to the forest supervisor and proposed a field project for my first husband and I, a vegetation inventory of the entire 2.5 million acre forest. It's 60% wilderness, which meant I got to be in backcountry a lot. And we mapped the whole forest, describing habitat types, which are associations of characteristic plants that define different habitats. So we started the project. We hiked and backpacked and horse-packed through the whole of the Shoshone starting that first summer. Now, mind you, you can't do the whole forest in one summer, but we sure tried. We did a lot of it. We described soils and landforms and other qualities of each habitat type. I analyzed what they told us about the relationships between plants and animals and all this cool science, and realized as I was doing it that essentially I was, in the mapping and description, I was telling the scientific story of what the land offered and how we might best steward it. And I just spent a lot of time doing the things I love, which made me very happy. The photo on the right is me in my happiest place ever, on a horse with a pack horse behind me out in the backcountry. I loved it. I really flourished. I loved learning about those rugged landscapes intimately. Like, I could take you to any place I've studied in the Absaroka Mountains and tell you exactly what you're going to find there and what it means for us as humans. And I loved all that. I know that landscape like the back of my hand, and I have the injuries to prove it too, from clambering up ridges and falling off horses and doing all that other kind of good stuff. Never got hit by lightning. I soaked up everything I could learn from the people I met, from my colleagues. I even liked writing reports, which made me even more of an outlier in the Forest Service office than I was already. And the next year I got promoted into the supervisor's office as forest field ecologist, plant ecologist, and I was like in heaven. I'd found my place in science, I'd found my place on the land, and I thought all was going to be great. I was still usually the only female in the truck on the trail presenting at meetings. And that didn't bother me, but it made a lot of my colleagues very uncomfortable. I remember the first time I went to the local game and fish office to give a talk on habitat types and how wildlife guides could use them. And I use guys not in a generic sense there. I walked into this room full of GNF guys dressed in their usual uniform. You know, the blue jeans and the burgundy shirts and the cowboy hat and the do-rag around their neck and the cowboy boots. And I'm wearing my usual blue jeans and t-shirt and ball cap. And as I approach the table to give this presentation, the guy at the head of it, without looking over his shoulder, says, "Honey, would you get the coffee?" I smiled, gritted my teeth just a little, and said sweetly, "Honey, I'm your speaker." He turned around and turned so red. I really thought he was going to have a heart attack right there. I just laughed. I just wanted to belong. I just wanted to be part of the group. So I leaned into science even more. I leaned into my logical left brain even more, determined to prove myself. I learned lab techniques to differentiate the different varieties of big sagebrush. I hate lab techniques, but I was going to do it. I was going to totally be part of that group. And I began writing my first full-length scientific publication, the sexily named grassland and shrubland habitat types of the Shoshone National Forest, with my first husband as co-author. Things were going totally swimmingly. Look at that, an actual scientific publication. And my God, it still exists, which is pretty amusing. And a couple of years later, I was backpacking by myself across the thoroughfare from the western edge of the Shoshone into the southeast arm of Yellowstone and out via the Buffalo Fork of the Snake into Jackson Hole on a 7-day backpacking trip by myself. And I'm out. I've been in the backcountry 5 days, and I'm crossing Two Ocean Plateau by myself with my big old heavy pack on my back. And I run across these two guys, and by then I'm kind of dirty, and my long hair is in a braid, but it still looks pretty gross, and I got the cap pulled down far. And I run into these two guys on the trail, and they want to chat, and they're wearing Forest Service uniforms, and they want to know my name. And I was like, "Susan." And they said, "No, what's your last name? You look super familiar." And I was like, "No, you don't know me." And I told them, and they went, "Oh, you're the author of Grassland and Shrubland Habitat Types." And I was like, what are the odds? I'm in the backcountry 5 days from the nearest trailhead, and these guys know my only scientific publication of any note. So apparently it was useful. I knew I had finally been accepted when I was invited to join the forest interdisciplinary team of soil scientists, wildlife biologists, me, and all the others doing habitat improvement projects. We started doing prescribed burns, which were a lot of fun for me because I had already been on the fire team by then and been on fire lines. And I was curious about how it was different when you weren't fighting the fire, but were actually encouraging it. And I really enjoyed being part of that team doing that. And then one day we did a sagebrush burn designed to kill sagebrush, which is my heart plant. And I'm out there with a drip torch. You know what a drip torch is? It's a kerosene tank with a little orifice, a little tube that you light, and it literally drips burning fuel wherever you go. So, you're wearing gloves and you're wearing all that stuff. And I'm lighting sagebrush on fire. And I said to myself, okay, this is what we're doing, and we're doing it because range science at the time said that sagebrush was an increaser, and in order to improve the range, the sagebrush grassland for cows and elk, we needed to get rid of the sagebrush. Okay, but I didn't believe, and I didn't say anything either, to my enduring shame. I didn't have the confidence in myself as a scientist to say, wait a minute, is this really a good idea for the whole ecosystem, or are we just doing this for cows? And if you can make a good argument for why we'd be doing it for cows, that's not a problem. But was it really helping the whole ecosystem to remove the shrub canopy that does all this good stuff for the system? I wanted to know that, and I didn't have a way to ask the question, and I still wish I had, but I didn't. So that brought me to kind of a crossroads in my life. Back then, sagebrush was the most common shrub in North America. Think about that. The very most common shrub in all of North America, not just the Intermountain West, where we still have quite a bit of it. It covered miles and miles of basins and valleys and mountain meadows with those twisting stems and the little silver gray foliage and that characteristic scent. The sagebrush sea of the interior West at that time covered an area significantly larger than the entire state of Texas. Imagine the state of Texas in your mind, if you can. Covered parts of 24 states and 2 Canadian provinces. That is a lot of sagebrush. And that dominance over such a large area is one reason why it wasn't appreciated. There was so much of it we thought it could never be eliminated. And it was so common we didn't respect it, the plant. Not long after that burn, my husband and I started grad school at part-time, working on the Shoshone the rest of the year. And in my first year of my dream master's program in grassland ecology, I got sick, really sick, and was diagnosed eventually with lupus, which is an autoimmune disease. It's a pretty serious one. And in short order, my whole life and career fell apart. My marriage imploded, I had to move. Things at the Forest Service got really tense because my then ex-husband and I were working together. So I did what any reasonable person who isn't really introspective would do. I just buried myself in my field work, often working solo. I'd be out of the office for 10 days at a time. I'd come back into town for 4 days, not see anybody, write up my reports, do my work, and ignore everything. That only worked for a little while. Finally, my forest supervisor, my boss, took me aside and said, here's the deal. You can't both work on the forest, you and your ex-husband. You have to go. Because I was the female. At that time, that was the rational thing to do. So it's winter, and I drive out of Cody on a bitterly, bitterly cold day. I've spent all of my money getting divorced. I have nothing, and I don't know where I'm going, particularly. I don't know who I am anymore. I've got this chronic illness that I have to learn to live with. And I've just left the landscape I still love with all my heart, and the career and fieldwork I had built. So I really didn't know who I was, and I didn't know where I was going, other than in the next few weeks since. And that, as so many crises can be, was the biggest opportunity in my life. Not right away. Didn't happen the next week. I was miserable for a long time, I will be honest and tell you, because I really didn't have any clue. But for me, that started the part of my life where I had to learn who I was and what I had to bring to this world, not just try and fit into someone else's expectation of who I would be. Really? Oh my gosh, I'm so slow. So I have 5 minutes, so we're gonna make this, we're gonna shorten a whole bunch of this. No? No, all right. I'm gonna not digress as much. How's that? What I had was a vague idea that I might find a niche in science journalism, essentially telling the stories behind the data. And so the first thing I did was move to Lander, where High Country News, a regional environmental newspaper, was headquartered then. And I worked as an unpaid intern for them and cleaned houses on the side so I could eat. It turns out I'm a terrible daily journalist. I don't think fast enough. But in their office, they had a whole shelf of books waiting to be reviewed of all the great nature writers of that day. Bob Pyle and Barry Lopez and Ann Zwinger and Charles Wilkinson and Gretel Ehrlich and Gary Paul Navin, all these amazing writers who I hadn't read, writing about the landscapes and people of the West. And so in my nights, I read all those books and I could see, oh, I could do that. Except, they had gone to school for writing and they knew what they were doing, but minor detail. I went back to graduate school, I revised my degree program, I got a job as director of the Women's Center part-time, and I acquired a stepdaughter and a second husband, thanks to one of my favorite volunteers who relentlessly for months set me up with this guy. And I had no interest in a relationship at that point. I mean, she would say, oh, Richard, this, and I'd be like, no, I don't know who I am, I don't need anybody. And finally she set us up, and I didn't know there was such a thing, but I fell in love at first sight, and pretty soon I'm married and I have a stepdaughter, and I'm married to an academic. Worse yet. So we moved to West Virginia for his first academic post. We lasted there 9 months. We moved to Washington State for 3 years. We moved to Boulder, Colorado, where Richard finished his PhD, and then Iowa for 2 years, followed by New Mexico. You cannot be a good field scientist when you move every couple of years. It's impossible to uproot that kind of practice and move. But we were following his academic career because he had the PhD and he could earn more money than I could. So by the time we had moved 3 times and landed in Boulder, I said to myself, okay, writing is the portable career, I've got to focus on that. I began writing nature columns for a local newspaper, and in my naivete and sort of, I don't know what to even call it, I wrote a letter to a local publisher and said, I have a book idea. I want to write a book about walking through Boulder and finding nature in Boulder. And the publisher called me on the telephone and said, we would love to publish that book. Is it done? When can we have it? And I was like, well, I haven't actually written it yet. So suddenly I was an author. Well, I wasn't yet because I hadn't written the book, but suddenly I could see that you could actually do this thing, write about nature, and maybe make a living. All right. That's a great Terry Tempest Williams quote, and I'm not going to go through it because I'm way behind. Story is the umbilical cord that connects us to past, present, and future. Think about that. We are meaning-making people. We are a meaning-making species, we humans, and we use stories as a way to tell us who we are, and how to link where we've been and where we think we might be going. And that to me, sums up what I've learned from writing, is that stories are the umbilical cord that links us to the meaning of our lives and our culture and our species. By the time that first book, Pieces of Light, was published, and it really was amazing. I wrote a book and someone published it. I didn't earn very much money from it. True confessions here. But it was a book. It still is. It's out of print, but hey, can't have everything. By the time it came out, we had already gone to Iowa and then moved on to southern New Mexico, where Richard had a teaching position. I went on a book tour, and never having done any of the writerly things you're supposed to do in college. I didn't even take a college English class. I was a science and photography major. I didn't have to. The first readings I went to, I thought, well, I'll just read from the book and people will not fall asleep. Well, actually, that's not true. They wanted to know why I wrote the book, what was behind it, what writing was like, how a scientist found stories. And I realized, oh, they want the story behind the story. I have to know something about why I did this, not just what the words on the page are. They can read those themselves. And that started me on realizing, oh, I have to know something about why I'm doing this in order to know myself and know my writing voice. The book opened the door to a career in freelance nature journalism, and I got to do all these cool stories. That's a sampling of the many feature articles I wrote over the years. My favorite one is on the upper right. You see that title, Can't We Just Blow It Up? That's a story for Popular Mechanics about the removal of the dams on the Elwha River in the Olympic National Park in Washington. A 30-year effort to even get to the 5 years it took to remove the dams. And the short answer is no, you can't just blow it up. Too much sediment behind those dams, it would have killed all the salmon that we were trying to save by removing them. But very fun story. My first story to be translated into 26 languages and 1 alphabet, Cyrillic. And going to interview the biologists, one a tribal biologist and one a National Park Service biologist who had spent their whole careers working toward removing those dams, was one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. So I got to write all these cool stories. Each story gave me a chance to be more of a scientist, to learn from experts about what they were doing and why they were doing it and why it mattered to us. And because I had a science background, scientists would tell me stuff they wouldn't tell other people because I got what they were doing in a way that made us colleagues, temporarily for a 2-hour phone call. But still, colleagues, and it was a lot of fun. And I also started learning how to tell a story, a true story, but make it compelling to someone who didn't know anything about dams, didn't care about dams, could care less about salmon, and would pick up that story and read it from beginning to end and be enthralled and learn something. To do that, you have to understand not just the science, but the story in the science. You have to be able to use quotes from the experts in a way that they become characters themselves. You have to learn how to draw a narrative arc. There's a beginning, things happen, there's tension, things change, there's a resolution, maybe at least partly. Those were the skills I was learning by doing. At first, I was really more on the end of the just the facts, ma'am kind of science reporting. But by the time I had written quite a few feature stories, I really did have an idea of how to make these stories compelling. And this is important because that's the weaving of both sides of your brain. You can't tell a good story with just your left brain. You can get the facts with just your left brain. But a story is not A, B, C, D, E. That's not a story. That's a sequence. The story involves the part of your right brain that makes intuitive leaps, that recognizes patterns, that learns meanings and wants to tell those meanings. So I was relearning how to be not just a scientist, but also to use my right brain. I had to learn to write as a reviewer of my first book, Pieces of Light, put it, with the precision of a scientist and the passion of a poet. This reviewer thought I'd already done that with Pieces of Light. I would argue, but she saw the possibilities, apparently. Science doesn't use metaphor. Science doesn't like to say, this is like this in your ordinary life, so you understand it better. We like to just say, this is what we know because we can prove it with the scientific method. We can postulate a theory, we can test that theory, and we can find out whether that theory is right. Science does not like to use adjectives and metaphor and dramatic progression. But if you want to understand science, really understand it, if you want to teach it to people who have no interest in it, you have to be able to tell the stories. So I relearned how to use my brain, both sides of my brain, in writing as I was writing. And one of my favorite stories is my third book, Barren, Wild, and Worthless, which is about when we were living in southern New Mexico in the Chihuahuan Desert, where I had never lived in my life. I wanted to feel at home there. So in my own science way, I thought to myself, oh, well, I'll write a series of essays about the desert, and that will allow me to learn all the ologies, geology, hydrology, zoology, anthropology, archaeology, and of course history too. So I proposed this book to University of New Mexico Press, and I dove into the research. I learned all this stuff. I wrote the book. I turned in the manuscript, and this is in the days when you turned in a stack of paper, and they actually wrote on it and gave it back to you. And my editor returned it with one word scrawled in red ink, oh, the dreaded red ink, across the cover, big, with 3 exclamation points, personalize. The scientist in me was like, holy buckets. And I wasn't going to say buckets, but, I'm trying to be good. What do I do? What does he mean? And I talked to him, and he said it really nicely. He said he didn't just want to know what I, the scientist, knew about the desert, even though I'd learned all these different disciplines and even history. He wanted to know what I, the stepmom and the wife and the passionate lover of plants, knew about the desert and why I cared. And I thought, wait, that means I can't just wear the science suit and hide in it? I have to actually be this me in public, in print? That was a big leap. But that is what, that was totally out of my comfort zone. But it's what taught me that I couldn't just speak with the authoritative, objective science voice to compel people. I had to actually be able to tell stories too. And so that brings me back to Hope Jaron and Lab Girl. One of the interesting things to me about Lab Girl is this quote, partly, because Lab Girl as a memoir is very much the scientist being a scientist. It's a really interesting structure to a writer. She has a chapter on plant development alternating with chapters on her life. So it starts with seeds, and she has some cool facts and cool stories about seeds, and then she talks about her childhood. And then there's a chapter on roots, because plants put down roots first before they put up shoots. And then she has a chapter about her college, a couple of chapters about her college experience. And the whole book is paced that way, which is really fascinating. But what's also fascinating is that you never really see inside Hope Jaron. She tells some fascinating stories. She's like many scientists, a little crazy around the edges, and she tells some great stories, but she never really lets you see inside herself. She stays very left-brained. She distracts you with all these stories about her lab and the crazy things they did and how they had to scavenge lab equipment and all that stuff. You don't learn until about 3/4 of the way through the book that she's married and has a kid. And you never actually learn much about them. They don't really come alive in the book. You learn a lot about her lab partner, who is as crazy as she is, and is brilliant. And their research is amazing. But you really never get to know Hope at all. But there's these occasional little moments where Hope peeks out, the actual person peeks out. And at the very end of the book, Hope peeks out big time. She has an epilogue where she makes a plea about this earth and our relationship with it. And she says, I want to ask all of you who read this book to plant a tree. And she talks about why you would want to plant a tree, the habitat it provides, the fact that trees, like all plants, scrub carbon dioxide out of the air, and that will help with climate change. And she gets really impassioned about it. And that is kind of the most personal moment of the book. It's really kind of lovely and also surprising because she's been sort of very distant about the memoir up till that time. So it's kind of fascinating. And I see myself in that book because it took me a long time to realize that by putting myself into the storytelling, people responded with more heartfelt appreciation. I was moving people. I can tell great stories about nature till the cows come home. But if I insert my own personal views, if I understand myself well enough to understand why my perspective matters, why it matters to me, people are compelled more deeply. So I learned very slowly over this life and writing that using both hemispheres of my brain made my writing better. And now and then I would surprise myself enormously. Those, by the way, small commercial, those are some of my books. There's lots of them. Some of them are science journalism, some of them are personal. That's all I'm going to say about those. But I would be writing, I was working on a particular book, and I'm going to go back one slide, the little brown book in the middle of the top slide, the San Luis Valley, which is a meditation on what home means, seen through the lens of a particular place in Colorado. And as I was writing the end of the book, I wrote 2 sentences that still surprised me because I didn't know they were in there, but they just popped out. I saw them appear on the screen and went, really? I wrote that? What we do best comes from our heads and our hearts. Not from our heads, but our hearts. From an ineffable impulse that resists logic and definitions and calculation. Love. Love is what connects us to the rest of the living world. The sacred urging from within that guides our best steps in the dance of life. And if you were going to sum up my whole philosophy of me, of how I understand the world, that's it. What our species does best is love, and I don't mean necessarily romantic love. I mean engage in joy and wonder and awe at the rest of the world. And until I wrote those sentences, I had no idea that that understanding was inside me. But those came out of both sides of my brain. And one of my very favorite articles that I wrote, and I'm going to make this very, very short, Audubon magazine asked me to write about sage grouse. And if you've lived in Wyoming any time at all, you know that sage grouse are an iconic species for our state because we are a big part of the sagebrush sea, and sage grouse are dependent on sagebrush. One of 350 species that are, I should point out, and they are very important in conservation and ecological health in the state. And if you've ever seen sage grouse, you know that they are some of the craziest birds in existence. They are the largest grouse in North America, and the males, and that's a male there, doing its full Las Vegas chorus line, I want to breed with the females who are watching me thing. The males congregate on leks, which we now know they've been doing on the same clearings in the sagebrush for probably thousands of years, not the same males, generations of them. And they do this demented chorus line dance. They puff out their chests. They have sacks that are colored just like egg yolk of good eggs, not store eggs, which they use their lungs and the air in their bones to pump out and make these booming sounds. They have plumes on their head that they put up, and they nod, and they strut, and they just look insane unless you were a cryptically colored female sage grouse hiding around the edge of the lek deciding who is studlier that you will mate with. I got to spend time following a sage grouse biologist around. I learned about new sagebrush research. I learned all the cool things sagebrush tells us about being a plant and being human, which includes behavior. Sagebrush actively respond to their environment by reorienting their leaves over the course of the day to catch the optimum amount of sunlight for food production and lose the least amount of water to the wind and sun. So if you take a video camera and you speed up the motion after you've watched the sagebrush all day, you will see the leaves actively reorienting themselves. The study that showed that was one of the first that proved that plants behave. They don't just passively respond to their environment, get buffeted around in the wind, as everybody did today. They actually behave in response to their environment. And the other thing I learned is that sagebrush were one of the first plants to show that plants communicate. There's a fabulous study by a researcher named Rick Carban at the university, he's in the upper left at the University of California at Davis. He and his colleagues and his students spent 20 years studying sagebrush. And it turns out that if you clip them to simulate grasshopper attacks, which is like, you know, having all of your skin eaten by a grasshopper, sagebrush exude volatile organic compounds, smelly chemicals, onto the air that act as alarm signals. Other sagebrush respond to those alarm signals within 30 minutes by producing enzymes that make them less edible. They make themselves less edible in response to these smelly chemicals that they take in within 30 minutes. That's cool enough. They also learned that if you're kin to the sagebrush that got clipped, you respond more quickly. If you're not kin, you still respond. If you, as in genetic kin, all sagebrush, but closer kin. The other thing they learned is that other plants in that community also respond to sagebrush's signals, their smelly chemicals that they exude onto the air, and they also make themselves less edible. That's one of the foundational bits of research in plant communication. We now know that plants don't speak in words the way we do. They don't even make, you know, those annoyed faces that we do when we want to not say something to somebody, but we want to communicate that we don't like what they're doing. We just make our face do something. Plants communicate with volatile organic chemicals, and plants are the original chemical factories. They make dozens of fragrant chemicals that they exude into the soil and on the air, and those are their, as one plant scientist told me, their vocabulary, their units of communication. That's pretty big stuff. It also introduced me to a whole new part of the way Western science is evolving. Carban and his colleagues published papers with multiple authors. He credits all his undergraduate students. He does all this cool stuff. He's created a community of researchers instead of going at it by himself, jealously guarding his findings so that he can get tenure before they do, that kind of thing. Suzanne Simard, who you might know through her work with the fungal networks that thread through forests. She started studying fungal networks in Pacific Northwest forests as a graduate student and found that trees use the thread-like mycelia of fungus under the soil to pass around water, nutrients, and also the molecules of communication and information. And that furthermore, it's not just a Douglas fir talking to a Douglas fir. Those networks communicate to all the various trees in the forests. And we now know in the sagebrush shrublands and in grasslands and even up in the alpine, those fungal networks work in desert ecosystems as well. Simard christened them the Wood Wide Web, which is a play on World Wide Web, because they act like information networks. There are nodes, older plants that control the traffic, who gets more water, who gets more nutrients, who gets more molecules of communication. So that Simard's work, which also very generously credits her colleagues and her students, just kind of blew open field science for me. And then Robin Wall-Kimmerer on the lower right, her work as a botanist, her first book, Gathering Moss, weaves her Potawatomi heritage and cultural knowledge with her science, which was Braiding Sweetgrass, her next book, which is the more popular one, which totally blew my mind. I mean, that someone could take one culture's knowledge that science hadn't used to respect and weave it into science just without blinking an eye, basically, really is a revolution in science. And I'm now seeing more and more studies that do that kind of thing. And that gives me a lot of hope, honestly, about our system of knowledge and our system of understanding the world. And it also taught me a lot about me. I'm going to tell you one more story, and that is set right here in Wyoming. It's about this dinosaur, 230 million year old dinosaur fossils. The study was published last year. These were found above Du Bois on the ancestral homelands of the Eastern Shoshone. And the researchers brought the Eastern Shoshone tribe into the study, asked for their cultural knowledge, what they thought about these bones. This little chicken-sized dinosaur, pretty cute, huh? This little chicken-sized dinosaur is the oldest dinosaur fossil in North America. And the name, which I am not going to try to pronounce because I don't speak Eastern Shoshone, is not in scientific Latin or Greek. That is a Shoshone name. That's, as far as I know, the very first, if I get out of the way, can you see it? As far as I know, it's spelled Ahvaytum, next word, Bahndoiveche, and it translates from the Shoshone roughly as, I think it's handsome young water creature, something like that. Long ago, handsome water creature. As far as I know, that's the first scientific name in an indigenous language honoring indigenous knowledge ever in a scientific publication. So totally, totally cool. That is an integration of knowledge that's equivalent to learning to use your right brain and left brain. Recognizing that other systems of knowledge have something to contribute to Western science is a revolution for Western science. As I was pondering all this a couple of months ago, and thinking about why still at this age I'm drawn to sagebrush, and I don't understand why, no matter how much I've learned about the shrub, I actually was sitting in my office at my writing desk, and I asked my dad out loud, why am I so drawn to sagebrush? Now, mind you, my dad has been dead for, I don't know, I'd have to do the math, but about 9 years. And I knew that. I just reflexively asked the question. He was an organic chemist. He appeared in my head, very clear image of his face, looking just like he looked when in high school when I was trying not to get a D in chemistry, which I didn't quite fail, but came really close. That patient sort of half smile of I love you and will you ever get a clue kind of smile. And he said one word, terpenes, very clearly. And then he was gone. And I'm not going to say what I thought because it's not something you should say in public. I was surprised, let's just say that. So I went to the science internet and I looked up terpenes, monoterpenes formerly. They're a class of organic compounds that are mostly made by plants. They're fragrant. And it turns out, to make a long story short, that 3 of them are the ones that make up the smell we recognize as big sagebrush. Camphorine, jasminine, and limonene. Camphorine smells like what you would think camphorish, think Vicks Vapor Rub. And jasminine smells sweet like jasmine flowers, and limonene smells sweet like lemon flowers. What I learned about them is that I, who have had lung issues my whole life, I've had trouble breathing my whole life, camphorine is a lung opener, and when you combine it with jasminine and limonene, it's not so harsh. And so my entire life I've had this habit. There's a big sagebrush shrub, I sidle over to it, I stroke its new leaves with my fingers, I inhale the fragrance off my fingers. That's why. That's an inhaler. I've just given myself a dose of a natural inhaler to open my lungs. I am allergic to every prescription medication you can imagine. My father developed them for a living. Oops. Especially inhalers, especially the steroidal ones. I'm seriously allergic to. They make me really sick. But I can walk over to a sagebrush, stroke the leaves, inhale them, and I breathe better. Remember how long we can go without oxygen? 5 minutes. Breathing is critical to our lives. And somehow the me that was not thinking in my logical left brain as a child knew that when I was around sagebrush and breathing that fragrance, I felt better. I had more energy because I was breathing better. So that's the full circle on life as a sometimes clueless plant biologist and what I've learned over the years. There I am in Yellowstone working on the sagebrush. I want to leave you with 2 thoughts. One is Hope Jaren's idea of each of us can do something for this earth and to give ourselves a chance to observe another living being like a plant. We can plant a tree, or if you live in a place like most of us do where it's not appropriate to plant a tree without adding a whole lot of water, you can plant a couple of native plants. A sagebrush if you want, and some bunch grasses, and maybe some wildflowers. And watch them over the years. Get close to them. Observe what they're like, how they behave. Think about how they communicate. And this thought, which comes from another one of my books. And it's a hopeful thought. To me, no matter how much we are screwing up this world in the midst of our mess, life as a whole is going on. The big sagebrush outside my house is still quietly pulling in carbon dioxide and exhaling oxygen. The mountain bluebirds are still hunting grasshoppers. The amaryllis plant on my windowsill is still blooming. Knowing that life as a whole is impelled to go on. It just goes on about its business, perhaps not unchanged by all the messes we make, but not defeated either. That is a heartening reminder that the living world turns not on our problems, not on human travails, but on something much more substantive, and that is the spark of life that animates this third rock from the sun. To me, that is just the most hopeful thing in the world. No matter what we do, life is still going on. And if we learn well enough, if we want to take part in it, we can do something positive to help, as Hope Jaron suggests. We can plant a few native plants in our yard. We can restore some habitat. We can do good things. We can just simply go out to our nearest far edge of our lawn where there's some plants planted or blooming and appreciate that world and vow to do a better job by it. So that's the thought I want to leave you with, and I just have to share something because I'm so excited about it. I have a new book coming out in October, and it's My Scientist Comes Out of the Closet about spirituality, about Earth spirituality. It's called Earthbound. It's a year of 52 weeks of short essays, beautiful photographs, and practices to reconnect with nature right where we are, like right here, on the wood harvested from oak trees that makes this stage. Thank you, oak trees. You had good lives. I could learn about you by studying your rings. Right where we are, we can reconnect to nature, and we can do a good job of being citizens of this planet. So that's what that book is about. Thank you. I'd love to answer questions. And yes.